Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Kelsey De Rinaldes. I'm the Assistant Cultural Affairs Officer at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo. I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Pamela Moore and Mr. Tim Campbell, our keynote speakers, as well as Dr. Setsuko Yokoyama, a Fulbright alumni and a moderator for today's event. And thank you to our audience of nearly 200 from both the US and Japan for joining us today. The US Embassy is hosting today's program in honor of both Black History Month, which Americans celebrate in February, and Women's History Month, which we celebrate in March. These months allow us to reflect on the past and the amazing contributions by African Americans and women that shape the history, society, and culture of the United States. During these months, we also celebrate our diversity, which not only makes us stronger as a country, but reminds us that there is still much work that needs to be done to achieve racial and gender equality. So we thank you for joining us today to engage in these important conversations that we hope will lead to greater diversity and inclusion in both the US and Japan. Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone that today's event is on the record and will be recorded. There will be English and Japanese simultaneous interpretation. Captioning for today's program is available through the UD Talk app in your web browser directly. Instructions for connecting were sent out prior to today's event. Following the opening remarks and presentations by our keynote speakers, we will open up the session for question and answers. We invite you to submit your questions throughout the session in the Q&A box. You can submit your questions anonymously. Additionally, during today's program, we will be conducting audience polling. We encourage you to participate. It is also completely anonymous. So now, I would like to invite you all to engage with us in some audience polling questions. This will help us to understand who is in the audience with us today and what your understanding of today's topic is. So you should be seeing the questions pop up on your screen now. Your answers, again, are completely anonymous, so we encourage you to participate, and we will give you a few moments. Great. The first question is, have you ever heard of the Civil Rights Movement? The second question, have you ever heard of the Black Lives Matter movement? And the third question, did you know that women played key leadership roles in advocating for social justice in the United States? So one more moment just to get in your last answers. Great, and now I'm sharing the results on the screen for you to see. So great news that almost all of our audience has heard of the Civil Rights Movement. If you don't know, you will know shortly. And similarly with the Black Lives Matter movement. And I'm interested to see that some people know that women played a key role in these movements. Some didn't. And we will talk more about the women's involvement shortly. So we hope that you'll be able to learn more about these topics. So without further ado, I would like to introduce today's moderator, Dr. Setsuko Yokoyama, who will begin our program and introduce our keynote speakers. Dr. Yokoyama is an ACLS postdoctoral fellow in digital humanities at Washington University in St. Louis. Her work focuses on redressing historical violence through art that heals trauma and builds a more just society. Her current research investigates the history of visible speech and how it intersects with linguistic imperialism, scientific racism, and techno-solutionism. She has recently been working with a group of multilingual Asians, Asian Americans, and members of the Asian diaspora who have digitally come together to address anti-Blackness within Asian and American communities. She holds master's degrees from Doshisha University and the University of Michigan, and a PhD from the University of Maryland. And again, she is a Fulbright alumna. So with that, Dr. Yokoyama, over to you.
Thank you for that kind.
Good morning. Thank you for the kind introduction. I'm Setsuko Yokoyama. I will be your moderator for this webinar. And thank you all for joining us through Zoom. Both Japan and the US are still under the ravage of pandemic, but we're having hard time. However, due to this, online lecture like this are becoming more common. Today, we are connecting 3 locations, Tokyo, Arkansas, and Maryland. As Ms. Abiko, who is in charge of program planning, said, it is only online that we can deliver lectures from all over the world like this. Today's lecture is about the history of civil rights movement in the United States and the role of women and youth in Black Lives Matter, which you may have experienced through the internet this summer. We will be talking not only the history of the movement of a more just and fair American society, but also to discuss together what Japan can do to fight structural racism on a global scale during this 1.5-hour set webinar. In the presentation by 2 lecturers, you may hear many things that you have never really heard of, such as historical events or language expressions unique to the United States. Please make a note of those points and ask them during the Q&A session in the second half of the session. Now I would like to introduce the 2 lecturers. Dr. Pamela Moore is from the Mississippi Delta region, which was the center of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. She earned Master of Public Policy from Harvard Kennedy School and Juris Doctorate from Harvard Law School, and also Doctorate in Higher Education from Jackson State University. She is currently Associate Dean for Global Engagement for the Office of International Programs and Studies and Assistant Professor in the College of Agriculture, Fisheries, and Human Sciences at the University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff, a historically Black college. In particular, she established the Global Leadership Initiative on campus based on the lessons and insights she learned from her own student activism experiences. Through this initiative, she has been committed to providing students with opportunities for community volunteerism, education abroad, and U.S. Peace Corps preparation. Mr. Tim Campbell comes from Central Little Rock in Arkansas. He graduated from Central High School in 2010, which is a school known for admitting first Black students in 1957. He was the first in his family to receive a high school diploma. He then enrolled in the University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff, where he studied physical health and wellness, earning a bachelor's degree in 2015, adding a new page to his family history. After graduation, he worked with the U.S. Peace Corps program as a community health facilitator in Gambia for 2 years. He is currently enrolled in the master's program at the Clinton School of Public Services at University of Arkansas. Off campus, he is focused on such activities as youth empowerment, racial equality, and social justice, and spearheaded a peaceful protest in the city of Little Rock after the incident of George Floyd in 2020. He was selected by the governor of Arkansas to serve on the commission to improve state laws and is active also as a founder of the grassroots organization Arkansas Movement.
Now, please help me in welcoming Dr. Pamela and Tim Campbell as I pass the virtual microphone over.
I take it that I may begin. First of all, I just want to say how happy I am to have this opportunity to talk about catalytic moments in movement building, the role of women and youth activists in the civil rights and Black Lives Matter movements. I believe that by talking about catalytic moments, we will help all audience members to appreciate that any individual can make a difference. It does not depend upon title or status. Next slide, please. So our presentation will be divided into 4 parts: an introduction, then we will talk about some basic concepts. In part 3, we will share stories and examples of women and young activists who have made a difference, and then the conclusion will follow. Next slide, please. Our basic goals today include the following. Both myself and Tim are from the southern region of the United States, and storytelling is very much a part of our culture. So while we do plan to share some historical details to introduce some interesting information, we also want to share a few stories to provide meaning behind the events that we will discuss. As I said earlier, we will talk about this idea of catalytic moments. In essence, we want to talk about the power of an event that may seem quite normal, but can have broader implications. We also want to discuss the differences and similarities between the civil rights movement and Black Lives Matter movement. Next slide, please. First, I'd like to begin with an opening reflection. Movements are social processes that evolve over time. They define who we are, the way we live, our histories, and how we view the world. I wanted to share this quote because what we hope to talk about this evening is not something far away. It's not about facts and statistics, but we're actually talking about a history that has personally defined us and our communities. So it's a very personal topic, and I must confess at certain points as we prepare for this process, it was a little emotional as well. Next slide. So here we would like to talk about some basic concepts. There are some terms that we will reference throughout our presentation that are used quite commonly in every country and across the world. But we want to simply share with you how we plan to use these terms during tonight's presentation. Next slide. So, movement and movement building. These are phrases that are used quite frequently in the African American community. We talk about the civil rights movement and and building movements and what's involved in making a movement successful. In the context of tonight's presentation, we will primarily focus on movement and movement building in the context of the struggle for human, social, and economic equality throughout African American history in the United States. By the same token, we also want to emphasize that our cause in this country has involved individuals from diverse walks of life. We are not simply talking about African Americans, but we're talking about people from different regions of the US, persons of different economic status, persons of different ethnic diversity. We're talking about a movement that has been inclusive. And I should also note that we're talking about a historical movement that began with slavery, the Civil War, the Reconstruction period after the Civil War, Jim Crow segregation, and at different periods in our history, the goals of our struggle varied at different times. Next slide. I like to use the metaphor of a river for movement building. In the past, when I have conducted leadership development workshops, we sometimes use the river as a metaphor for history, life, and change. And what's powerful about the river is that if there is an obstacle, the river flows around the obstacle. This metaphor is very important for my community. As you see here on the map, if you look at that left-hand section of the state, this is the region we call the Mississippi Delta. And this region is right beside the Mississippi River. And so our lives have been defined by the river. So when we talk about the river as an illustration of the power of movements, we have something very much we can relate to. This particular civil rights activism during the 60s, and at some point I will talk about or make reference to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I thought it would be interesting to share with you just a couple of lines from the poem by Langston Hughes, one of our foremost prominent African-American poets. He wrote this poem called "The Negro Speaks of Rivers," and he talks about rivers like the Nile beginning in Africa. But at one point he says, "I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset." And it's interesting that he talks about Abe Lincoln, who was the president responsible for the emancipation of African-American slaves. Next slide. At this time, I'd like to invite my colleague. He is a graduate of the University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff, and we have worked together, and we're so proud of his activism as a graduate of our university, and he will talk with you about the Black Lives Matter movement.
Thank you, Dr. Moore. Now I will talk to you all about, as she stated, the Black Lives Matter movement. And as Dr. Moore kind of stated earlier before, movements have a lot of moving parts. And the important thing about movements is to not be overwhelmed with trying to spread yourself thin across all parts of a movement. This particular movement, called the Black Lives Matter movement, has been active across many fronts and many different tragedies. I'm going to share with you briefly their timeline of events. In 2013, three Black women got together and organized the Black Lives Matter movement. Their names are Alicia Gaza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi. 2013, Trayvon Martin was tragically killed in the state of Florida. In 2014, Eric Garner and Michael Brown were tragically killed. And just to revisit Trayvon Martin for a second, he was only 16 years of age. Michael Brown, 18 years of age. The Black Lives Matter movement started as a simple hashtag to support the greater cause for the ending of police brutality and also the ending of the killings of African American women and men. In 2015, the Black Lives Matter furthered its diversity in its movement by supporting 21 transgender people who were killed in the United States, 13 of those of which being Black. In 2016, Alton Sterling and Philando Castile, which were both tragically shot by law enforcement. In 2017, the Black Lives Matter organized around the white supremacist rally that happened in Charlotte, Virginia. 2018, the killing of Stephen Clark, who was 22 years of age. 2019, the killing of Isaiah Lewis, who was only 17 years old. And recently, the killing of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery. Next slide, please. The Black Lives Matter movement has two parts to it. And a lot of people may or may not know that this movement started as a simple social media hashtag. However, there's a difference between the hashtag of Black Lives Matter and the organization. The organization, which was created by the three powerful Black women, is called the Black Lives Matter organization. They have chapters all across the United States. The hashtag is something that has grown and has built a diverse power of voice for all types and all strategies of Black Lives Matter organization. One of which is the embrace of LGBTQ issues, which stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer. It's also decentralized, serves as an umbrella for diverse causes, including poverty, police and law enforcement, and also anti-bias and anti-racism. There's a stronger focus, however, on police brutality, law enforcement reform, and criminal justice reform. They also advocate for technology and media, body cameras on police officers, mobile phone cameras, 24-hour news networking, and of course, raising visibility and globalizing the movement. They have also established groups of people called cop watchers. As you can see, when there's a killing of a Black unarmed person, there's a video that usually surfaces the internet very quickly. These videos are usually recorded by bystanding people or citizens that are watching the current events, or some people that actually have an initiative to record police officers as they deal with particular groups and race of people. The Black Lives Matter movement has not only started a global reach as it relates to social justice, it has also ignited activism in a lot of different diverse countries, such as Europe, Africa, and other parts of the world. I have a personal story. During my reach of activism over the summer after the George Floyd events, I organized protests, and shortly after, I would post some of the organization that I was doing to my social media sites. Not long after, I had a very close friend and colleague to reach out to me who was currently staying in the Gambia where I served as a Peace Corps volunteer. He asked more questions about what I was doing and why I was doing it. I explained to him the issues that were happening with Black Americans in America as it relates to police officers. He quickly felt a passion and an emergence of empathy for the things that I was articulating to him. Shortly after, he reached back out to me maybe 2 days later and said, I'm requesting a permit from the United States Embassy, the Gambia, to organize a movement here to support the cause of Black Lives Matter. I reacted surprisingly like, okay, great. I hope that, that works out. And it wasn't until 3 days later, I received a video that brought me nearly to tears to see my counterparts in the streets of the Gambia in front of the United States Embassy supporting the Black Lives Matter movement cause. And also to even see them chanting the same chants that I would post on my own Facebook page. Next slide, please. Now, Dr. Moore.
Thank you, Tim. The question has been asked, is there a difference between the Black Lives Matter movement and the civil rights movement? I like to think, and I believe during the course of this presentation, many of you will agree as well, that the Black Lives Matter movement is the contemporary expression of the historic civil rights movement here in the US. So when we use this term, the civil rights movement, it's important to understand that we can use this term in a very broad sense, as well as in a specific sense. So I like to say there is the civil rights movement with all lowercase letters that refers generically to a historic process. And then there is the civil rights movement, which tends to refer to a very specific point in time, beginning with the foundation being laid in the mid to late 50s, taking full expression during the 60s, and then gradually winding down in the early to mid 70s. So typically, when we talk about the civil rights movement with capital letters, we're really referring to that specific period in time. Next slide. Now, during the capital letter civil rights movement, this movement was also quite diverse and decentralized. What I think was one important difference is that we had nationally prominent leaders, most of whom were men, who had such power and such presence that there really was this perception that, hey, Martin Luther King was the leader of the civil rights movement, when in reality, he led the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. It did have influence, but it was not the only organization engaged during the civil rights movement. Some of you may be aware of individuals who were in his circle of leadership, young men that he mentored, he groomed. Reverend Jesse Jackson, who later established People United to Save Humanity. John Lewis, a very powerful US congressman who recently passed, was one of his lieutenants. Andrew Young, our first African-American ambassador at the United Nations. Oh, I'm sorry, correction, he was our second most prominent African-American diplomat. There was a lost in history, but I won't go into that now. And then there was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And these organizations focused primarily in the South. They expressed at least a philosophical acceptance of nonviolent strategies. And they concentrated primarily on voting rights, desegregation, equality and fairness under the law. There were also what we call our national mainstream organizations, such as the NAACP, the National Council of Negro Women, the Urban League, and the Congress of Racial Equality, which organized the freedom rides in the South. Next slide. In other parts of the country, primarily large cities, urban areas, East Coast, West Coast, there were more radical expressions of the struggle for justice during this period. And these organizations outright said, hey, you know, we're not into this nonviolent stuff. We feel that we should defend ourselves if necessary. So this picture you have here is a picture of Malcolm X, who was a major spokesperson for the Nation of Islam, and he's visiting with Fidel Castro at one of the hotels in New York City. Stokely Carmichael began his activism with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and then he created the All African People's Revolutionary Party. I had the opportunity to personally interview him for my school newspaper when I was in college. And then Huey P. Newton was one of the two founders of the Black Panther Party, which had a strong presence primarily in the West Coast. Next slide. So when we reflect upon the Black Lives Matter movement, the civil rights movement, there really was no formula, no scientific approach that automatically predetermined what would be successful as a social justice method and what would not. What we think is that for some reason during that point in history, primarily the 60s, there were these catalytic moments that just had these spiral effects. And during these moments, the individuals involved may have had outcomes desired, but they would never say, hey, I predicted this would happen. Some of the actions that were taken were not necessarily outside of what we would consider normal behavior. For example, the sit-in movement consisted of men and women walking into a store and sitting at a lunch counter that just happened to be for whites only. So what should be so radical about sitting at a counter? Some events appeared spontaneous, but does not mean they were unplanned. when we talk about direct action again, we're not necessarily talking about a traditional form of direct action, such as a rally or a protest or a boycott. When Rosa Parks got on the bus in Birmingham, Alexander, she made a decision: I am going to take a seat wherever I choose. And who would say that that was radical? But that event sparked the Montgomery bus boycott, which became a major event in the civil rights movement. So catalytic moments spark change, but it's important to understand that change may be slow. Sometimes an event may occur and we may think, hey, that was a failure. We didn't achieve our goal. And then sometimes an event occurs and there's an immediate reaction. And even if there is an immediate reaction, sometimes that immediate reaction years down the road can lead to even greater impact in the future. Next slide. So now we'd like to focus more particularly on the role of women and youth in these two movements. Next slide. Okay, Tim.
Thank you, Dr. Moore. In this picture is really, really powerful as it relates to youth and social change. Here you have a demonstration by youth in 1963 in Birmingham, Alabama. Next slide, please. Little Rock, Arkansas, building on a tradition of student activism. Little Rock, Arkansas has a long history of student activism. This activism particularly started in the 1950s with the Little Rock Nine. Me personally, I was born in the urban inner cities of Little Rock, Arkansas. I was motivated to join the global movement of activism and social justice, particularly because of the issues my parents faced and I observed them face throughout the course of their lives. My father, who tried tirelessly to get out of the bounds of criminal justice, which today leads me to my decision to support criminal justice reform. My mother, who struggled endlessly with poverty, which leads me to pick up the tools needed to support people that may unfortunately be on the lower end of the social economical ladder. I'm a graduate from the Little Rock Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. Central High School is historically known for the Little Rock Nine. The Little Rock Nine, I like to call the Little Rock 10 because I cannot leave out Daisy Bates, who was their leader and also a local social activist. Nice story. My grandmother actually was a housekeeper for the Daisy Bates. And as a child, I would be able to go to Mrs. Daisy Bates' house, not knowing the great work she had done throughout her lifetime. I knew one thing about Daisy Bates at that time. I knew that she had a lot of cats, and me personally, I was afraid of cats. So being a Central High graduate, later I was able to learn about the works of Daisy Bates in the Little Rock Nine. She led a group of 9 students into a segregated school called Central High. Central High was located in a segregated neighborhood. In the 1950s, a lot of the areas in Little Rock were segregated. Central High was predominantly white. However, Dunbar High School was predominantly Black. The foundations for activism in Arkansas started here with the Little Rock Nine, their bravery, their courage, and their ingenuity to basically adopt the skills and the power of force to go inside of a very, very tense environment. Seeing this set foundations for not only activism, but also social justice and moral good in the state of Arkansas. Their foundations supplied a healthy, expressive space for identifying African Americans in Arkansas to recollect, reflect, and learn from their experience and open up broader conversations around racial equity in the state of Arkansas. The Little Rock Nine serves as a great example on a national scale for what true activism truly means. Regardless of the tension at the time, they still held brave to what they believed to be true, and they executed. Many don't know that the Little Rock Nine actually started as the Little Rock 100. Over a course of time and meetings with Mrs. Daisy Bates and her husband, Elsie Bates, they set out to do trainings to prepare students for tense spaces such as school reform, police reform, and also social reform with restaurants and open spaces. This narrowed down really quickly to 10 students as they began to get their school clothes ready to embark on the journey of um, going into the school, the Central High School. One student, which was a identifying Black woman, was pulled out of the lineup of the Little Rock Nine due to bomb threats that were placed upon her family's homes and her friends' homes. So for those reasons, her family pulled her out of the fight for Little Rock Central desegregation. Now, our issue in Arkansas is not so much educational reform as much as it's criminal justice reform and community policing, bridging the gap between citizens and police officers, between working class people and policymakers and stakeholders. Next slide, please. The making of a movement. I borrowed this title after it was posted in a major newspaper magazine article with a member of my organization on the front, and it titled Making of a Movement. Steps in my own personal journey. Obviously, after the George Floyd event, Black America fell in tragic, emotional spaces. I think that with this being magnified on a global scale shows the sensitivity on the particular event. George Floyd, however, was not a begin of a movement. It was not a first for Black Americans to experience or to see another fellow Black American being harassed by local authorities. George Floyd served as more of a tipping point for the frustration, for the anguish, for the unequitable spaces that most people of color experience in America daily. One of the first things I did in planning my own personal movement in Little Rock, Arkansas, was doing personal vision sessions with myself. I had to ask myself, how did I want to go about creating or making a movement here in Little Rock? So I reached out to local allies that I knew had great platforms and great community service um, initiatives that were currently happening in the city. After reaching out to them, we organized together 3 rallies at the Little Rock State Capitol. These were rallies that stayed peaceful, no one was hurt, no one was injured. And they also provided healthy spaces for people that were experiencing hurt and anguish at the time to express themselves. Shortly after, we discussed and negotiated needs with Governor Asa Hutchinson and Mayor Frank Scott, who serve as leaders of the Arkansas community, on a political realm. Me personally, I would join the task force to advance the state of law in Arkansas, which was the first in the nation. The task force serves as the first example of police reform in an expedited timeline in the nation. Next slide, please. Reflections on progress achieved. But before I speak on progress achieved, I would like to speak on some of the challenges that I faced while making my personal movement. Diverse responses to social action. There were many other social action responses at the time to the George Floyd event. However, personally, I wanted to keep my activities peaceful, humble, and expressive. Some were more radical. They felt the need to vandalize or to set fire to small objects and to make their anger seen by the nation that way. I personally disagree with that particular way. Also, policing and public safety. Policing and public safety was at the top of the list of priorities after the George Floyd events. So speaking to both police and public safety stakeholders about how traditional their policies were and how there needed to be change in particular areas to bridge the gap between citizens and police officers was tough at times. And in the reach of social justice on a national scale being ignited, there was also a flux of inner city youth violence between Black African American boys. These three things serves as my top three challenges throughout the course of making a movement. Some of the positive outcomes. One of the positive outcomes is Arkansas Task Force. The Arkansas Task Force worked for 8 months to come up with 27 official recommendations to police policy. Some recommendations around enforcing body cameras, police patrol safety, and also community policing, and putting that as a top priority for the state of Arkansas and policing. Also, leadership of Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson. I personally was able and privileged to build a great relationship with our state's governor. He was very receptive to the issues and to the emotions and the deep emotions felt at the time by people that related to the Black community or identified as African American. Lessons learned and teachable moments. I learned a lot of things. And one of the greatest things I learned is that when you're making a movement, you will never be bigger than the movement itself. You're a part of the movement. And accepting roles within that movement is not only healthy, but it's beneficial. And it creates team play amongst social activists and social activist activities. Next slide. Dr. Moore.
I have to remember to unmute here. Wow, this picture in the middle is just so powerful. You have women in other parts of the world and the country who are not African American and may not have experienced racism or poverty, and they raise the Black power symbol. when you think about the Black Power symbol, it's usually associated with urban radical groups. Very few people are aware that Stokely Carmichael, when he was with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, actually made this a national rallying cry during a rally in Little Greenwood, Mississippi. Next slide. This is a picture of Daisy Bates, a young lady that Tim was talking about earlier. I had to think long and hard about including this picture because it doesn't really represent the best of Southern culture. And we do have to keep in mind that women, white American women, were supportive of the civil rights movement and the women's rights movement, and then in some instances, white women were very much aligned with segregation and racism. And what's so powerful about this picture is that you see a young lady who's so cool, calm, and collected against a backdrop of real emotion and hatred. Next slide. Okay, wow, as Tim said, it all started with a hashtag. At the moment that the hashtag was created, it had some impact. I want to read a quote to you here. Though it's now ubiquitous, used by politicians, celebrities, TV networks, corporations, we hear Black Lives Matter all over the place. But in 2013, when it was created as a rallying cry, it was only tweeted about 5,000 times in a nation of over hundreds of millions of people. Later in 2015, after the incident in Ferguson, particularly during the heights of community protests, the hashtag was used almost 60 times a day. And then later in outrage, when the police officer involved was acquitted, all of a sudden it was used over 170,000 times. So we're looking at a gap of like 5 years or more between the date that this hashtag was created and the building of a powerful movement. Next slide. We only have about 5 minutes left. So I will summarize, we will quickly summarize the rest of the presentation, and we can respond to some of these aspects during the Q&A session. The lady you see here is Fannie Lou Hamer. Never had a formal education, was a sharecropper, but her life changed when leaders and activists with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee came to Mississippi and began developing leaders and empowering sharecroppers like Fannie to vote. Fannie Lou Hamer was actually a victim of extreme police brutality. She was beaten mercilessly and suffered from health challenges for the rest of her life. This picture is of Fannie Lou Hamer at the Democratic National Convention challenging the National Democratic Party to allow African Americans to join freely and participate in the voting process. At the time, the Democratic Party only granted the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which was an integrated party, only allowed them 2 seats at the national convention. And Fannie Lou Hamer made the comment, I didn't come all the way here for no 2 seats. Next slide. But something really great happened, even though that catalytic moment didn't seem so catalytic. Almost immediately after the convention, the Democratic Party began to integrate its ranks. And but for that moment at the 1964 convention, I really wonder if we would have had an African-American president, an African-American vice president, and a fearless leader like Stacey Abrams, who, although she did not win the governor's race in Georgia, created a nonprofit organization that rallied voters and shifted the state of Georgia from Democratic to Republican. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay. Yes, okay, I'm sorry, next slide. We would like to quickly end our session by showing you the pictures of 2 young men whose lives, whose deaths laid the foundation for powerful movements. Many of you may not know about Emmett Till. 14-year-old young man traveled to Mississippi from Chicago and was brutally murdered because he was accused of flirting with a white woman. The men who murdered him were acquitted. And it seemed as if the story, faded away, but quietly people were so angry, they began to mobilize. And this particular story really was a critical event in the mid-50s that laid the foundation for the 60s. Tim?
Next slide, please. The story of Trayvon Martin. Trayvon Martin was from Sanford, Seminole County, Florida. And the event occurred in 2012. A 16-year-old Trayvon Martin, at the time of his death, mixed ancestry who identifies as Hispanic, whose name was, George Zimmerman, was acquitted by jury, national and global, and it garnished national and global attention. Mobilization and important foundation for emergence of the Black Lives Movement, and of course the Black Lives Matter hashtag. Next slide.
So once again, we end with the same reflection we began with, and that is that movements are social processes that evolve over time, and they do define who we are, the way we live, who we become, our histories, and how we view the world. Next slide. Next slide, thank you. So this pretty much concludes our presentation. I think Tim and I can breathe a sigh of relief. We attempted to cover a great deal of information in a short amount of time. We really want to thank the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo for making this event possible, as well as Ms. De Rinaldes, Ms. Abiko, our moderator, Dr. Yokoyama, our interpreter, and all other persons involved with logistical support. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, so we want to thank you for your time and attention, and we are happy now to receive your questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much, Dr. Mua and Tim. I wish you can hear the warm rounds of applause from the audience members. This is great. Dr. Mua, what you said about the metaphor of river, I found it especially beautiful. That is how the river keeps flowing even when there are obstacles. And I thought that this metaphor of fluidity is especially apt today as the Black Lives Matter movement, as Tim, you kindly explained it to us, it started by Black women across the gender spectrum. So what a metaphor, and what a metaphor to keep working towards collective liberation. And though the struggle, does continue, it is also quite heartening at the same time to know that there are over 250 people today who have registered for this talk, hoping to learn from your experiences of and expertise on social justice movements in the US. So, and we have a good number of questions coming in, so I'd like to jump right in. So Dr. Mua, you opened the talk with how social justice movement in the past and today concerns equity for all. And Tim, you offered us an overview of the Black Lives Matter movement, but Black Lives Matter movement, unfortunately, is often mischaracterized as a movement that only concerns Black lives. Could you help some of the audience members understand how Black Lives Matter movement is working towards collective liberation by centering Black lives?
Okay, great. Black Lives Matter movement has supported, of course, been around the injustice around African Americans, not just because they're targeting African Americans to do work behind, but because African Americans suffer to the criminal justice system, to police violence at higher rates in the United States than any other demographic of people. The Black Lives Matter movement does a great job of advocating for allyship amongst all communities. And if you look at a lot of Black Lives Matter rallies and protests, you will not just see African Americans. You will very much so see a large range, diverse groups of people supporting individual causes and global causes as well. So the Black Lives Matter movement is categorized around, well, usually is seen as, oh, they only support African Americans, which is not true. I think there's a very, very new movement, and it has not necessarily identified exactly how they want to move forward in other countries and other communities. But I think right now the central focus is around the demographic of people that are experiencing the most criminal justice or violence as it relates to criminal justice and policing and poverty and also health issues in the United States of America.
Thank you. Let's see. Dr. Mua, there's a question from somebody who's living in Japan, who's interested in supporting the Black Lives Matter movement, but don't know much yet about. If you could share with us how you got involved or involved in the civil rights movements, if there are any books you can recommend or your favorite book that has been formative for you, we'd like to hear.
Okay. Well, the way this presentation was set up, by me being the senior citizen, my focus has been more on civil rights, with Tim taking the lead for Black Lives Matter. I would like for him to talk about how to get involved in that movement in very specific ways. But the book, I would say that any person who really wants to understand grassroots organizing should read the book, I've Got the Light of Freedom by Charles Payne. the civil rights movement was not just one movement. Even in the South, there was a male-defined kind of leadership that had visibility, that focused on big events, big rallies, big marches. And that was one piece of the struggle here in the South. Here in the Mississippi Delta, women and youth activists created a very different kind of model. The members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee were so radical. They were radical just because they came to Mississippi. So their story is documented. It talks about valuing each person's contribution, building leadership quietly, living in the community, breaking bread with the people you serve. You don't just come in for a big event and get on the plane and leave. So I would highly recommend that book. It actually received an award from UC Berkeley, and it documents what we call the grassroots building side of the civil rights movement, not just here. I mean, the book focuses on this region, but the story isn't just limited to this part of the country. I've got The Light of Freedom by Charles Payne. I'm looking at it now. Tim, did you want to talk about, like, you know, specific ways to get involved?
Great, I can do that. First, I want to make clear that I am not a member of the Black Lives Matter organization, and I am not a chapter member of the Black Lives Matter organization. They have a website, blacklivesmatter.org. As it relates to the organization, if you want to see more of the work that they do on a global scale, on a national scale, and local scale, and they have events, they have current events, upcoming events that you can tap into. And a lot of the movement now is social media. I think that a lot of our listeners can relate. I like that 97% in the beginning during those posts, you know, 97% is a great number, but I think that maybe 90% of that is because of the power of social media. They also have a Black Lives Matter organization Instagram, which is Black Lives Matter. You just type it in, their org is there. But personally, the Black Lives Matter movement itself, which I have been a successful agent in, and I'm continuously striving to be a successful agent in itself, I think that solidarity is the word. I think that opening up spaces around your colleagues and with your friends and your teachers around these experiences in America of racial prejudice, of inequity, open up those conversations. I think that shows great levels of solidarity. And also posting to your social media, using your individual platforms to advocate on a social level for the injustices that are happening in the United States, not just with Black Americans, with all people of color that are experiencing injustice.
Thank you, Tim and Dr. Mua. And Dr. Mua, thank you for sharing your experience of how the movement you were part of was based on the community, that you ate together, you looked after each other, and that's where the things were at. And thank you, Tim, for mentioning the allyship, because it does speak to a couple of questions that we are receiving. So this is a question for Dr. Mua and Tim. When thinking about solidarity and allyship in a global context, what is the role of people who don't identify as Black? How can we work together?
Well, it's interesting that the question is framed around race, because I lived in Nigeria for 2 years. I worked on a USAID democracy project. And during the time I was there, my staff people who were Nigerians just didn't believe we had problems in the US. And when the Black Lives Matter movement really became powerful, I kept asking myself, how will young people in Nigeria relate to this? And interestingly, it really wasn't much later that we started getting news of rallies in Lagos, one of the largest cities in Africa. And the issues were not so much around Black Lives Matter in the American sense, but around police brutality, the role of the military. And having lived in Nigeria, I know what it's like to be in a car, the taxi driver's driving too fast, you get pulled over by the police, and the guard just came over and yanked the guy out of the car. And we were shocked. So I think the issue is really not about race, but how you look at these issues in your own national context, or your own community, or your own cultural group, or however you identify, and find the commonality that speaks to fairness, that speaks to justice, that speaks to the role of law enforcement, that speaks to how minorities may be treated in your own country, and whether there are laws that protect minorities. I think that any movement that honors that would be very much embraced within the Black Lives Matter broader movement. Now, I do want to say one thing. I saw some questions about how does this movement connect with Asian Americans or the Asian parts of the world, or non-whites. I think, frankly, there's some ambivalence around that comes from within Asian communities. And let me put it in context. People may be surprised to know that there are Asian communities in the Deep South that go back generations and decades, and even decades more. And what we find when we look at that historical experience, we find that at one point in time, Chinese Americans were treated almost like African Americans. They had Chinese schools, Chinese cemeteries. In some instances, members of the Asian community integrated and married within the African American community. And then there are instances in which Asian Americans assimilated more so into the white community. I did some web searches to look at the different countries across the world where Black Lives Matter resonated. And frankly, I did see more resonance in Europe, Africa. And what I saw more so in Asia was more of the beginning of a dialogue around how these issues relate to us. And that's okay. I think every great movement has to begin with a novel thought or challenging thought. And if individuals are able to well, you get my point. So, but if individuals are able to talk about these things, then that can be the beginning of something.
Mm-hmm. And that is the ongoing conversation, even in the United States, about the allyship between Asian American communities and Black communities, and how resorting to policing wouldn't keep anybody happy under the existing systems. Now, Tim, given there are many college students in our audience members, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. In the US, there's this tradition, and beautifully embodied by the words of John Lewis saying, "Get into good trouble, necessary trouble." And that's such a fantastic tradition here. In Japan, the label of being a troublemaker is still quite stigmatized. And many college students worry that their activism might be self-sabotaging when thinking about applying for corporate jobs. What would you say to those students?
Wow, that is exactly some of the fear I had when I started my, working in the movement work. I think that I can relate to those issues because here I am, a college student, uh, well known around the city. I want to keep great face in the church community, which is also a big culture in the African American South. I want to save face in my family. I know traditionally what has happened to people that have led movements, whether they be silence or even to the extreme of assassination. So there's great fear around the topic of how do I get involved? And if I do, what's next? I like to live by the quote of James Baldwin, who quoted one of my favorite, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. And that's one of my favorite quotes. And it speaks to me in a way that basically says that if you see a space or individual empathetic space where you personally can take social responsibility, I think that it's almost mandatory that something happens. Because as James Baldwin said, it won't change until it's faced. And there isn't a tradition maybe in Japan of facing these controversial issues. But I think that tradition has been broken even in the African American community where there's not, as in the civil rights, Dr. Moore said, you have these spearhead leaders. Now, no one knows who the leader of the Black Lives Matter movement is because everybody's involved. Everybody's excited. Everybody's wanting to scream their voice for social justice. And this is very new. There's no leader this time. There's no group. There's no group like the NAACP, for example. There's no particular group. You can go to every state in the United States and see, or you can Google it, Black Lives Matter movement protests going on. Some led by members of the community, African American community, young as 13. So there isn't even an age discrepancy anymore. And you will see some being led by people old as 50, old as 60. And also I want to emphasize that every movement and every demonstration doesn't look like hitting the streets with signs and posters. The movements around the world have been very multifaceted. So if you look in Nelson Mandela's movement and the prison movement he started while being incarcerated, basically going on work strike while inside of the prison, that looks totally different, right? From hitting the streets with posters and signs. And if you also look at the issues of colonization in West Africa, there was an 11-year-old girl in the Gambia who fought the British on hunger strike in her school. They were in British schools, and she said, well, I don't want to eat today until the Gambia is a free country. Hunger strike, like there has, and that's very extreme. I'm not telling anyone not to eat, but the movement looks extremely different across the board. And some people got involved in their movement by going to social media, spreading awareness. And as Dr. Moore said, having dialogues, which is the tip and the start of every great movement. And it's not the most exciting part. It's not the part that's going to make the news. It's not the part that you're going to see the pictures of, but it serves as the root. It serves as the foundation for what potentially can happen when a person stands up.
Amazing. And Dr. Mua, I'd like to make sure that we also have something for educators, NPO workers, and government employees who are in our audience today. Given what we learned about the role of youth and women, how can we, the older ones in the movement who are more experienced and have perhaps institutional powers behind us, how can we empower youth and people across the gender spectrum?
Okay, well, I am aware of the little notifications that time is of the essence, but allow me to share an example again from my work in Nigeria. I find that the US government, there are either programs overseas for youth through our global apparatus, or there are programs for youth in the US through our domestic apparatus, but there are too few opportunities to connect youth leaders across countries. I know that's not something that can be changed overnight, but opportunities that allow youth from other countries to come to the US. So the funding may only support youth from other countries, but if there's some event or activity or whatever in the US that connects youth to youth, that would be great. The YALI program, the Young African Leaders Initiative, is great, but I think it may be just a little too institutionalized, and that we need to get those young professionals out in the community engaging with their peers. So I'm going to stop there and once again say that I'm just so grateful and humble to have the opportunity to share with so many people tonight about important aspects of our history and culture that I think has influenced the world. Thank you.
Wonderful. I wonder if we could squeeze one last comment from each one of you, because this is significant talk that we've been witnessing and being a part of. Dr. Mu and Tim, could you share with us what kind of more equitable United States you are envisioning, and are there any immediate action items on your plan, on your plate?
I'll go. So in terms of my vision for a greater America, and it's really subjective. I can't speak for everybody else, but I'm going to tell you what I want America to look like when I grow up. I would like to feel home in the world that I call home. I would like to feel a place. I would like to feel like a neighbor in America and not a villain. I would also like to feel like a citizen of America and not a criminal. I would also, more importantly, like to feel like a African American in America and not a racial slur. I think for me, the look is an internal, and it's not necessarily about what I want to see as much as about how I want to feel as an African American. I would like to see African American kids being taught about the very conversation we're having today, citizen engagement and social justice, not in the 10th grade or the 12th grade, but in the first grade, in the second grade. I would like to, we learned a lot today about Fannie Lou Hamer. I would like to see little, not only Black children, but white children, Latina children, Mexican children, Asian American children saying, this is the lady that I want to do for my science fair project. I would like to see more of the Black African American experience connect to the African experience, because there's a long history of wonder. Because I've lived in the Gambia, and they always wonder, like, are you white? Are you half white? Like, what are you? Is your parents from the Gambia? Like, how did it work? And also, people when I got back to America asking me, how do they live in the Gambia? What is it like? I would love to go there and just connect that and make that identity a global one that can work together with Asian communities, with European communities, and with your communities all around the world. That is my America that I envision when I grow up.
And on that note, I think that says it all.
And I second it. Well, thank you so very much for sharing your expertise, your experience, insights. Let me pass the microphone over to Kelsey de Rinaldis.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for that wonderful presentation. And thank you to the audience for your great questions. There were many more that we received than we could answer. Before we end today's program, I would like to invite our audience to take a second poll to help us understand how you see today's program in relation to your own lives here in Japan and the role that each of us can play in creating a more diverse and inclusive society. So please go ahead and take a moment to answer those questions. And while you take a moment to answer, I would like to thank our speakers, Dr. Moore and Tim, for joining us today and for sharing your expertise and your personal experiences with us. And of course, thank you to Dr. Yokoyama for your expert moderating and leadership of the event. And of course, a special thank you to our simultaneous interpreters and technicians at NHK and to our captioners at UD Talk. We are grateful that this session can be available to many in both languages and accessible as well with captions. I'll give a few more seconds to our survey here. So thank you all for taking a moment to answer. All right, I'm going to show the results. So you all can see this now. Thank you for sharing your thoughts about how women in Japan as equal important drivers of social change, and as well how we can take concrete action to achieve social justice in Japan. So lastly, I'd like to invite our audience to take a short event survey. You will see the QR code pop up on your screen now. So please take a moment to share your feedback about today's program. We will continue to host events throughout March in celebration of Women's History Month, and also have several funding opportunities available to empower women and advance gender equality. Please see our Embassy and American Center Japan websites for further details. Thank you all so much again for joining us today. Thank you to our speakers and to our moderator. We are grateful for your time, and we hope that you all continue to remain safe and healthy during these uncertain times. Thank you so much again, and take care.